Racist cops thought it was funny, pulling over Big Shaq like he was just another name to mock. Laughed at the walk, ignored the face, forgot to check the badge behind the silence. But the joke didn't age well. Because Big Shaq wasn't just passing through, Big Shaq was their new mayor. And now, every badge answers to the man they tried to humiliate. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Ashford Heights, Georgia, didn't have official lines dividing one life from another, but everyone knew where they were. You crossed Maple Avenue, and the coffee shop served cappuccinos instead of drip. Crossed it again going the other way, and the sidewalks cracked under years of underfunded promises. The courthouse sat like a clean crown above the older neighborhoods, and the police station, trimmed in new paint every summer, guarded the line like a sentinel. It was a Tuesday morning when Shaquille O'Neal stepped onto that line. Tall as a billboard and quiet as a held breath. He wore a simple gray hoodie, faded jeans, and basketball sneakers that had seen years of walking. No camera crews, no entourage, just him, alone, strolling through a block the deputies rarely walked, unless they were called. He wasn't smiling, wasn't frowning either, just thinking in the way a man does when he's halfway between peace and preparation. Deputy Carter Ewell saw him first, sipping gas station coffee and squinting into the morning sun. His partner, Riggins Holt, leaned on the hood of their patrol SUV with the kind of posture that said he'd rather be anywhere else. They watched Shaq as he passed the bakery window, his silhouette reflecting in the glass, like a question that didn't fit the answer they wanted. "Who walks down here without a purpose?" Holt muttered, nudging Carter with his elbow. "Big guy like that." "Yeah," Carter said, already reaching for the excuse. "Might be casing something." They didn't ask where he was going. They didn't ask who he was. They didn't have to. In their minds, the story had already been written. The SUV pulled up alongside the curb, tires grinding to a halt, like punctuation on an unwanted sentence. Carter rolled down the window, voice laced with mock friendliness. "Morning there, big fella. Everything all right?" Shaq stopped, looked at them. His voice was calm, gravel warm. "Everything's just fine." "You got ID on you?" Carter asked, already stepping out of the vehicle, hand resting on his duty belt like it was muscle memory. "I do," Shaq said, reaching slowly into his hoodie pocket. Holt joined him on the sidewalk, circling just enough to make it feel like a setup. "You look familiar," he said. "Play ball somewhere?" Shaq handed over his wallet without argument. "Used?" Carter chuckled as he took the ID. "Used to be famous, huh? You got that voice. Like one of those sports dudes on TV." Holt laughed under his breath, probably trying to sound like Shaq or something. "Yeah, right," Carter snorted. "Big Shaq out here taking a walk alone. That'd be the day." But then Carter flipped the ID over. His smirk fell. Holt leaned in, read it too. There, in bold print on a Georgia government-issued ID, was the name they had just mocked. Shaquille O'Neal. And underneath it, Mayor-elect Ashford Heights. The silence between them wasn't just awkward, it was exposed. Shaq didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice. He simply looked them both in the eye, not with fire, not with smugness, with something heavier, like a mirror. Carter cleared his throat, handed the ID back like it was made of glass. "Didn't realize, sir. Thought maybe, well, we get folks walking through here sometimes who don't belong," Shaq offered, his tone still even. Holt scratched his neck. "No disrespect intended." Shaq pocketed the ID. "None taken. Just remember next time, a name shouldn't have to make someone visible." He kept walking, never raised his voice, but every word hit the sidewalk like a dropped stone. By the time he reached the edge of City Hall, word was already moving. Ashford Heights was small enough for stories to travel faster than facts. Half the precinct knew before lunchtime, but the deputies didn't file a report, didn't mention the exchange. Instead, they buried it in silence, hoping it would be forgotten by dinner time. But it wasn't. Because a clerk named Janelle, who happened to be walking to her shift at the bakery, had caught the whole thing from across the street. She didn't take a video. She didn't post a tweet. But she did tell her aunt, who told the choir director, who told Pastor Wallace, who didn't believe in silence when truth was due. By Sunday, the whispers had turned to questions. People remembered the campaign speeches, the quiet town hall meetings Shaq held during the election. He didn't promise miracles. He promised mirrors. He said he wanted the city to see itself clearly, not the picture in the brochures, but the one behind the curtain. That morning on the sidewalk, wasn't a scandal. It was proof. Meanwhile, at the station, Carter and Holt felt it. Not the guilt, but the shift. The way conversations paused when they entered a room. The way officers double-checked names before making assumptions. The way the chief called a community sensitivity review, without using the word mistake. Shaq never filed a complaint. He didn't call a press conference. Didn't give them the fight they were bracing for. He didn't need to, because something more effective was already happening. Exposure without explosion. A week later, when he walked into City Hall for his first official briefing as mayor-elect, a receptionist stood up instinctively. People noticed that, not because he demanded respect, but because respect had shifted its weight toward him, quietly. Upstairs in the briefing room, department heads waited with polite tension. They had read the news, seen the headlines tiptoe around the incident. New mayor encounters unusual welcome. Former NBA star's small-town wake-up call. But none of that matched the actual truth, which was much simpler. Two men made an assumption, and got humbled. Shaq took the podium at the front of the room. No suit. No script. Just that same gray hoodie, now ironed. "I'm not here to scold anyone," he began. "I'm here to lead. And that starts with seeing." He paused. Let the quiet hang. Not just seeing the parts of the town that look like you. Not just the people who walk where you feel comfortable. I mean seeing everyone. Even when they're not shining. Even when they're not clapping. Even when they look like trouble. Because sometimes that's just how survival dresses itself. He didn't call names. Didn't point fingers. But Carter, watching from the back, felt like every word was a fingerprint pressed against his badge. Shaq wrapped up with a story. Not about basketball. Not about fame. About his mother. About how she once told him, "The first time they see you as a threat is the last time they see your heart." Then he stepped down, nodded to the crowd, and walked out the same way he walked in. Quiet. But this time, no one mistook his silence for weakness. Outside, kids played on the steps. A little girl asked her mother, "Is that the mayor?" Her mother smiled. "Yes, baby. That's the mayor. And he walks just like us." Ashford Heights didn't change overnight. But its center of gravity did. Because when truth walks through the cracks of power and doesn't flinch, the cracks get wider. And that's how you start shaking a town. One walk at a time, dramatic tone, layered with irony and suspense, emotional undercurrent of vindication. No physical violence, rich with character development and narrative flow. Ashford Heights hadn't changed overnight. It was still the town where favors flowed in. Whispered debts, and justice came late. If at all. But something subtle cracked the concrete that week. The kind of shift that doesn't scream. It hums beneath the surface, gathering weight. The morning after the election, City Hall was quieter than usual. Reporters circled the building like flies waiting on a rumor to rot. Inside, a man in a plain gray coat walked through the hall without a security escort, without a wave to the cameras, no entourage, just a thick folder in his hand, and a look in his eyes like a man who's already read the last page of the book and knows how this ends. Shaquille O'Neal, known to most as Big Shaq, took his seat behind the mayor's desk the way someone might sit at a kitchen table before sunrise, collecting his thoughts before the house wakes up. He didn't touch the nameplate, didn't care about the chair. What mattered was in the files. Years of missing documentation, audit trails that stopped cold, payments that didn't match projects. A silent trail of betrayals disguised as business. No speeches. No smiles. 2 weeks ago he was standing outside the gas station, with a crate of peaches he'd brought in from his cousin's orchard. Carter and Holt pulled up in their cruiser, like they were checking on a loose dog, told him to move his operation, or get me. When he asked why, they said he was loitering. When he quoted the city's vending policy, they laughed. One of them took a peach, bit it, tossed it back on the crate. The juice hit Shaq's shirt like an insult. He didn't raise his voice, just packed up, slow and quiet, and walked away. That night, the first votes started coming in. Across town, Carter and Holt sat in their usual booth at Ronnie's Grill. Holt had his boots up. Carter was sipping sweet tea like it was holy. They were mid-story, retelling their peach stand intervention, when the TV above the counter blinked red. Unconfirmed results suggest write-in candidate Shaquille O'Neal has taken a commanding lead in the mayoral race. Carter froze, straw in mid-sip. "Nah, different guy. Can't be him," Holt said, half laughing but slower now. But it was him. The same man they laughed at. The man who kept his head down while they threw their weight around. The man who didn't flinch when they got loud, didn't record them when they smirked. Back in City Hall, Big Shaq turned another page. There was a memo dated 6 years back, signed by a deputy city manager who'd since retired. It authorized surveillance equipment in specific neighborhoods. Neighborhoods that just happened to vote 80% against the incumbents every cycle. Coincidence, maybe. But Shaq didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in patterns, and this pattern stank. He jotted a note, underlined 2 names, closed the file. Outside his door, Clara Mullins, his newly appointed assistant, watched him like someone trying to read a chess game 3 moves in. "You sure you don't want to do a press conference?" she asked again. "Nope," he replied, eyes still on the file stack. "You're the first mayor in 30 years to win without a party endorsement. People want to hear you speak." "They'll hear me," he said. "Just not yet." Shaq knew the power wasn't in saying something loud. It was in doing something quiet that echoed later. Meanwhile, the old guard stirred. Councilman Riggs called an emergency session. Not public, of course. Just the insiders. They met in the back room of the Oakwood Masonic Lodge. Like they always did when things got shaky. The mood was sour. Riggs slammed his hand on the table and cursed the circus. "We let it happen," he growled. "You think this Shaq guy just won? This was orchestrated. A message. A slap in the damn face." Someone mentioned calling a recount. Another suggested a vote of no confidence. "He's too clean," said Beverly Granger, the city clerk. "You pull anything obvious and it looks like retaliation. People already think we rig everything." She looked around the room, the irony not lost on her. "We need to make him stumble," Riggs said. "Not crush him. Just shake the pedestal." But they were too late. Shaq wasn't standing on a pedestal. He was digging under it, exposing the cracks. By Friday, the first audit orders had been filed. Contracts were being pulled, one by one. He'd found a pattern in streetlight replacements. 2 bought $4 million, allocated over 8 years. Yet whole blocks still lived in darkness. He visited those blocks himself. No press, just Shaq in a hoodie, walking with folks, listening. And then came the letters. Handwritten notes, not press releases. Sent directly to departments, officials, vendors. Each one started the same. "I have questions." No threats. No accusations. Just quiet accountability. It was more terrifying than rage. Carter got the call on Monday. Internal affairs. Not public. Just a meeting. "Routine," they said. He hung up, sweat beading on his neck. "What'd you do?" Holt asked, half joking. "Nothing recent." They both laughed, but the air had changed. That nervous kind of laugh you do when you feel a current pulling you under. Later that day, Shaq called a meeting. Not at City Hall. He rented the old library on 12th and Main. Made coffee himself. Invited every community organizer, teacher, and street vendor he'd met over the years. Some didn't come too skeptical, but the ones who did found a circle of chairs and a dry erase board. No podium. No press. "Tell me what needs fixing," he said, "and tell me what they've been ignoring." They talked for 4 hours. By the end, he had a binder full of notes and 3 new committees forming. None of them with official titles. Just people doing work. Holt tried to bluff it out. "Dude's just making noise," he told Carter. "He'll burn out. People don't like change. They like the idea of change." But even he didn't believe it. Then the text came. A number neither of them recognized. "That drifter you laughed at? He's your boss now. Might want to read the policy book." No signature. Just a screenshot of the mayoral seal. Carter stared at it for a long time. On the 7th day, Shaq finally spoke publicly. Not at a podium. On local radio. WFMX 98.1. The kind of place where people still call in with school announcements and church cookout times. "I'm not here to punish," he said. "I'm here to repair." The host asked if he had enemies. "Not yet," he said. "But I expect some folks might start hating the truth." The lines lit up. Some praised him. Some were cautious. One man called him a fluke with a file cabinet. Shaq didn't respond. Just thanked him for calling. Later that night, Holt sat alone in the station locker room, scrolling through city codes. The vending ordinance popped up again. It was clean. Shaq had been in the right all along, and they'd mocked him for knowing it. Carter called. No greeting. "What if we are the bad guys in this one?" Holt didn't answer. At City Hall, Clara watched from the office doorway as Shaq closed another folder. You ever going to tell them how you pulled it off? Shaq looked up. They already know, he said. They just don't believe it yet. Outside, the town ticked forward. No parades, no headlines, but something was shifting. Something steady, like the sound of a peach pit, hitting pavement and rolling into the gutter, easy to miss unless you knew what it meant. The squad room at Precinct 9 was never truly quiet. Radios clicked, chairs scraped, phones rang. Even in downtime, there was a hum, a rhythm, grizzled jokes, stale coffee, and that same faded corkboard with faces from 5 years ago. No one had taken down. But when the news finally sank in, the silence that fell was unnatural, not a respectful kind, not even the guilty kind. It was the silence of people who'd realized they weren't in control anymore. Carter dropped his pen. Holt sat back, arms folded, blinking like he misread something. The chief, still in his office, opened the glass door just enough to peer out. A thin laugh, awkward and high, escaped him. Well, hell, must be some kind of mix-up. Nobody replied. They didn't need to. The morning's chatter about the write-in joke had curdled fast. Every officer there had either witnessed or heard about the gas station incident. The man they'd brushed off, laughed at, intimidated out of his spot. He hadn't disappeared or fought back or gone to social media. He'd walked his way into city power. Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal didn't need a microphone to be heard. That morning he'd walked into the council chambers wearing the same coat he'd had on when Carter told him to move along. No flashy suit, no entourage, just a worn-out binder tucked under his arm, and a question He waited for the opening announcements to finish, listened politely through a minor zoning dispute and a sidewalk repair request. And then when it was his turn, he spoke just above conversational tone. How many excessive stops have these two made this year? He didn't name Carter and Holt. He didn't have to. Everyone turned to look at the row reserved for department liaisons. Only 2 officers sat there. The room chilled. You could feel it. The tightening of breath, the sudden absence of rustling papers, the tension behind every eye blink. Councilwoman Estelle Granger cleared her throat. Hi, Mayor O'Neal, I don't think we... Shaq looked at her. Not a stare down, just a calm look, like someone waiting on a simple answer. Should be in the monthly report, right? It was. A thin, often skipped section, tucked into a 45-page packet. Nobody had ever asked for it aloud. Granger fumbled, then signaled to her aide. Within minutes, the figure was on the record. 73, the aide read out. Combined total for the year so far. 38 for Officer Carter. 35 for Officer Holt. And how many resulted in citations? Shaq asked. The aide hesitated, checked again. 4. A low murmur ran through the room. Shaq nodded. Thank you. And that was it. He closed his binder, gave a small nod to the chair, and sat back. No outburst. No long speech. But in that silence, Ashford Heights began to understand what they were dealing with. The next day, Clara watched Shaq from the door of his office. He had a map laid out over his desk, with a red pencil tracing lines between neighborhoods and patrol routes. You planning a speech for the press? No, he said without looking up. Planning a shift. She waited. I don't want to embarrass them, he added after a moment. That's what they'd do. Make noise. Push it into headlines. I just want to make it impossible for them to do this again. Clara stepped in. Curious. How? Shaq pointed to a block of notes scribbled in the margins. Mandatory logging. Random audits. And a community observer program. Pilot tested in the North District. You think they'll cooperate? They won't have to like it, he said. They'll just have to adjust. At the precinct, Carter sat in the break room, nursing a soda like it was his last comfort. Holt paced. This guy's making us look dirty. You think we ain't? Carter snapped. Holt stopped mid-step. That's not what I meant. Carter shook his head. Nah, I think it is. I think we spent too long convincing ourselves the job was about instincts, gut calls, knowing trouble. We turned laziness into intuition and called it experience. Don't go noble on me now. But Holt's voice lacked conviction. Neither of them had slept much since the council meeting. Meanwhile, things were moving behind the scenes. Shaq started sending letters, not memos, letters. Hand-signed, addressed personally to division heads, council members, and key community leaders. Each one asked a question. Not an accusation. Just a probe. What metrics define your success? How often do you seek feedback from the people you serve? How are complaints processed? And how are they reviewed? The simplicity of the questions disarmed people. There was no threat in them, just accountability. And yet each one landed like a pressure point. Soon, conversations began shifting. Committees restructured. A few board members resigned for personal reasons. Shaq never commented. The media wanted sound bites. They got silence. They called it a leadership enigma. But those who paid attention saw something clearer. A pattern emerging. A quiet storm rolling through old systems. Councilman Riggs, who'd mocked Shaq's campaign as a fluke driven by bored progressives, found himself increasingly isolated. His office's discretionary budget was quietly frozen for review. Old permits resurfaced with discrepancies. He called a meeting with Shaq thinking it would be a confrontation. It wasn't. Shaq listened, asked 2 questions. Riggs left 14 minutes later without saying goodbye. Clara asked Shaq afterward what had happened. "I let him know the chessboard's real now," he said simply. At the next council meeting, a motion was introduced for a citywide review of police-civilian interactions, specifically focusing on non-citation stops. It passed with barely a whisper of resistance. Afterward, Shaq approached Carter and Holt directly. No staff, no audience, just the hallway behind the chamber. "You boys ever plant something on someone?" he asked, quiet but direct. Holt shook his head. "No." "Good," Shaq said. "Then you've got nothing to hide." Carter's mouth opened, then closed. Shaq waited. "You planning to take us down?" Carter asked finally. "I don't need to," Shaq said. "You'll either adjust or get replaced by someone who already has." Then he walked away. The local paper ran a column the next week, titled "The Mayor Who Doesn't Perform." It questioned whether the silence, the lack of spectacle, meant inaction. Clara clipped it and handed it to Shaq. "You want to respond?" He read it, folded it once, and tossed it in the recycling. "Nah," he said. "They'll see it." And they did. Because 3 weeks later, the data from the first Community Observer pilot came in. Incidents during patrol stops had dropped by 47%. Complaints were down. And one particularly vocal local pastor, previously critical of all politicians, wrote a blog post praising the program's transparency. Nobody saw it as dramatic. There were no fireworks, no police chases, or late-night busts. Just a quiet shift. Back in Precinct 9, Holt walked into the locker room and saw Carter sitting on the bench staring at an open file. "What's that?" "Policy manual," Carter muttered. Holt sat down beside him. "You think we're gonna make it through all this?" Carter exhaled. "Slow. Only if we shut up and start listening." They sat there a while, neither saying much. And maybe for the first time in years, they weren't the ones writing the story. They were reading it. Ashford Heights didn't explode. It didn't riot. It didn't collapse or sing songs of sudden change. But block by block, department by department, the ground moved. A little more sunlight reached the cracks. Some still scoffed. They called it a fluke, a lucky election, a phase that would fade. But those who'd been watching closely knew better. Because power hadn't just changed hands. It had changed tone. And that was louder than anything else. They said he came out of nowhere, but Ashford Heights just hadn't been looking. Shaq had always been there. In the overlooked corners of the city, standing behind folding tables at voter drives, volunteering at food banks without ever tagging a single photo. When the cameras weren't around, and when the spotlight finally swung his way, it wasn't because he demanded it. It was because too many people had run out of excuses to look away. Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal didn't ask for permission to lead. He just started doing the work no one else would. He walked every block of his district before his first month in office ended. Not once for show. He'd stop to talk, not talk at old men on stoops, single moms juggling groceries, teens shooting hoops into warped rims. He'd scribble notes on napkins, envelopes, corners of flyers. Then he'd walk into City Hall the next morning and track those notes back to the budgets that ignored them. He dressed the same way he always had. Dark hoodie, worn sneakers, sleeves rolled just enough to show work. When a reporter asked if he'd clean up the image now that he was in office, he blinked and replied, "You clean up what's dirty. I'm not." It wasn't a line. It was just true. Every Friday, he hosted open hours in the same youth center that had been padlocked since 2017. No security, no staff filter. Just Shaq at a folding desk, a pot of coffee, and a line that never stopped forming. Kids wandered in at first, out of boredom, curiosity, maybe hunger. He ordered pizza with his own cash, kept a bookshelf stocked with second-hand comics and city grant forms. Every time someone thanked him, he'd wave it off. Just here to help you make your own way. The nickname came naturally. Not Mayor O'Neill. Not Mr. Mayor. Just Mr. Shaq. Like he belonged. Like he always had. By month 2, the reading program was running full tilt at the old library. Same one the council tried to close the year before. He reopened it without fanfare, on a rainy Wednesday, turning the lights back on with a team of volunteers and donated bulbs. Kids poured in, not because it was fancy, but because someone finally made space for them. A space where nobody was trying to fix them, just fuel them. But as the city warmed to him, the precincts grew cold. Whispers began to coil through the back halls and locker rooms. He's up to something. Looks like a hero. Moves like a chess player. Keep him in check before he gets teeth. They tried small things first. Skipped briefings. Delayed his data requests. Sent deputies late to meetings. All the things institutions do when they want to punish someone without leaving fingerprints. Shaq didn't flinch. Instead, he doubled his presence, not in confrontation, but curiosity. He visited the 3rd precinct on their morning shift change with warm coffee and sat through their intel brief, without speaking once. He asked how officers were coping with overtime. He asked about their mental health resources. When they shrugged him off, he nodded like he understood. Because he did, but he was listening for something else. And he found it. Buried in patrol logs was a pattern: consistent delays in dispatch response to certain neighborhoods. Unexplained lags between incident reports and filed statements. It wasn't just bad administration, it was targeted neglect. He didn't storm the chief's office. He sent a copy of the compiled data, annotated in his own hand, with a single sticky note. Let me know how I can help clean this up. Or if you'd rather I bring it to session. The message wasn't threatening. It was a choice. The chief sent back a typed reply within 2 hours. A request to meet. Privately. In that meeting, Shaq didn't gloat. He didn't even bring staff. You're not the enemy, he told the chief. But you're protecting systems that act like one. The chief shifted, uncomfortable. You know politics doesn't run on feelings, right? I'm not running on feelings, Shaq said. I'm building on memory. And that was the difference. Because Shaq hadn't forgotten anything. Not the locker room laughs when he'd try to volunteer at events years ago. Not the sideways looks when he applied for city grants. Not the time a councilman called him a community mascot in a donor mixer. He remembered every slight, every dismissal, every closed door. And he was still standing. The whispers shifted. Watch him close. He's too polished to be naive. Maybe this was planned. They weren't wrong. Shaq wasn't reacting. He was building. Quietly. Deliberately. He funded a conflict de-escalation course for community volunteers, paid for by a combination of his mayoral stipend and silent partners who believed in the long game. He didn't tweet about it. He just got it done. He hired analysts. Young, underpaid but passionate, to start a shadow review of city contracts going back 10 years. Not to punish. To understand the... He partnered with 3 neighboring towns on a shared data exchange to track municipal response times and service disparities. By month 4, the infrastructure beneath the city's indifference had started to crack. Still, people waited for him to mess up. They always did. It was too strange, too unorthodox, too calm. Nobody leads like that without a motive, they said. But Shaq didn't care. He spent his time listening. Sometimes to pain, sometimes to dreams. Most often, to frustration, so old it didn't even have words anymore. One night, after a long council session, he walked back to his apartment instead of taking the city car. Rain was coming down steady. A kid, maybe 15, trailed him from 2 blocks back. Hoodie up, hands jammed into pockets. Shaq stopped under a flickering streetlight and waited. The kid approached, cautious. You really the mayor? He asked. Shaq nodded. The kid squinted. You don't look like one. Good, Shaq said. Maybe you will. They stood in silence for a moment before the kid walked off. No speech, no lesson, but something shifted there too. In private meetings, old power brokers tried to find his angle. You're building trust too fast, one said. That's dangerous. To who? Shaq asked. You're gonna raise expectations. Then I better meet them. They didn't laugh. They understood now that nothing about him was small. Not his stride, not his memory, not his ambition, and certainly not his patience. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Didn't need applause to know he was making impact. He moved like weather, slow at first, then unmistakable. And every inch of progress he made was earned, not claimed. There were those who still waited for him to crack, but they were looking in the wrong places. Scandal, rage, corruption. They didn't realize his greatest power wasn't in destroying things. It was in building things they couldn't take credit for, and he did it without ever demanding a seat at their table. Because by the time they looked up, he'd already built a better one down the block. And the people were already seated. It started as a routine system check. Shaq was auditing police logs for response times, comparing timestamps to community complaints. He wasn't hunting a scandal. He was tracking inefficiency. But that's the thing about rot. You don't have to dig deep when it's been allowed to spread for years. Sometimes you just open the wrong folder. Or in this case, the right one. It was tucked inside a backup drive. Mislabeled surplus records. An analyst flagged the metadata anomalies. Odd file creation dates. No document titles. Just strings of numbers. The drive had no official case files. No surveillance logs. No training videos. Just images. Hundreds of them. At first, Shaq thought it was evidence storage. Then he clicked on the first file. A photo of a man, mid-40s, standing by a grocery store wall. Hands up, expression blank. Over the image, someone had scribbled "Shop King" in red text. The second image was of a woman, seated on the curb with a parking ticket taped across her mouth, captions "Silent Runner." And then there was a boy, no older than 14, wearing a white t-shirt. On the shirt in thick Sharpie, the word "thug." Each photo had a nickname. A taunt. A private language of mockery. Shaq didn't breathe for almost a minute. It wasn't just Carter and Holt. They were the most prolific, but other usernames appeared in the file paths. Officers, dispatchers, a few community service aides. This wasn't one bad apple. This was a private game, a quiet ritual of cruelty kept alive in shadows, meant never to surface. But it had. Shaq didn't scream, didn't slam anything. He closed the folder and asked for a fresh printer cartridge. That night, alone in the mayor's office, he printed every photo, one by one. Grainy, unedited. The printer whirred like a slow metronome of grief. He bound the images in thick black leather. No labels, no flourishes. Just the truth, weighty and cold. He made 13 copies, one for every council member, one for the chief, and one for the city archives. On the cover of each, nothing. Inside the front page, a single sticky note. You fund this. Fix it. He delivered them himself at dawn. Walked through the government building before the offices opened, placing the books gently on each desk. No warning, no speech. By the time the council meeting began, the building was silent. Councilwoman Granger didn't speak for the first 10 minutes of the session. Her copy was still open. A photo of a man with "Loot Lover" written across his jacket spread across the table. She kept touching the corner of the page, like she wanted to tear it out but couldn't. "I don't understand," someone finally muttered. "You do," Shaq said quietly, from his chair. "You just didn't think it would look like this." There were no reporters present, no cameras, just truth and people trying to survive it. Councilman Riggs cleared his throat, looking for footing. "We need a full investigation." "No," Shaq interrupted. "You need reform. You fund the department. That means accountability starts with you. But we didn't approve this. You didn't stop it either." The words weren't angry. They were surgical. Not a shout. Just a mirror held still. Across town, the precinct was unraveling in whispers. Someone noticed the audit team arriving with locked cases. Someone else saw the chief pale after receiving an envelope marked "Confidential Internal Review." By midday, half the force was silent. Carter sat in his cruiser, staring straight ahead. Holt paced the garage, furious and brittle. "You think he's bluffing?" Holt asked. Carter didn't answer. "He's got nothing on us. They were just pictures." "Just pictures?" Carter's voice came out flat. "You know what they'll do with that phrase in court?" Silence. They'd always seen themselves as untouchable. Until now. Because Shaq hadn't gone public. He hadn't made it political. He made it unavoidable. By week's end, the council had voted unanimously to open a civilian-led review board. For the first time in Ashford Heights history, a mayor personally appointed each member, drawn from neighborhoods disproportionately targeted by police activity. Shaq didn't hold a press conference. He just posted the names to the city website, each one linked to a brief community bio. The binder never made it to the media. Not directly. But change has a way of leaking. 2 city employees quietly resigned. 1 officer filed early retirement. Dispatch protocols were suspended pending retraining. Still no public outrage, no riots, just a ripple, a silent wave of discomfort washing over old foundations. Shaq visited the youth center the following Saturday. Kids were waiting for him with notebooks and popsicles. No one brought up the photos. But one girl, quiet, maybe 10, asked, "Are you gonna make it stop?" Shaq looked at her and said the only thing he could, "I'm gonna make it hard to ever happen again." Meanwhile, City Hall was tense, not with chaos, but with the weight of reckoning. Department heads started rereading old approvals. Vendor contracts got second eyes. The IT division doubled its compliance checks. One morning, Clara found Shaq sketching flowcharts on a whiteboard. Arrows, blocks, timelines. "You building a case?" she asked. "No," he said. "I'm building a system that outlives me." She paused, watching the board take shape. "They'll come after you eventually." "Let 'em," Shaq replied. "I'm not playing the same game." The final blow didn't come from Shaq. It came from within. A junior officer, disturbed by the images, submitted an anonymous affidavit. Verified. Corroborated. Backed by timestamps and metadata. Internal Affairs launched a silent investigation. No leaks, no statements, just a series of locked computers, suspended logins, and closed doors. Carter and Holt were both reassigned. Pending evaluation.
They weren't arrested.
Not yet, but their badges no longer carried weight in City Hall. When Carter passed Shaq in the corridor one day, he didn't speak. Shaq gave him a nod, nothing more. That silence said everything. The city didn't erupt in applause. There was no parade, no campaign bump. Just a slow awakening. People started showing up to meetings. Parents asked more questions. Council votes weren't rubber-stamped anymore. The words community trust stopped being talking points and started being metrics. In the folder, Shaq kept one copy in his office drawer, not to threaten, to remember, because the sickness wasn't just in the shadows, it had been tolerated. He wasn't interested in vengeance. He was interested in ending the game. And the only way to do that was to make sure no one ever wanted to play it again. There were no hashtags, no headlines in the days leading up. Just a quiet message passed from one hand to another, whispered at food drives, scrawled in chalk near basketball courts, slipped into church bulletins. 2 p.m., Sunday, Police HQ, wear black, say nothing. That was it. Shaq didn't post it, didn't endorse it publicly. But everyone knew it came from him. For weeks the air in Ashford Heights had been taut, like something was about to snap. After the folder incident, after the council review board was seated, after 3 internal suspensions and 1 quiet retirement from a senior dispatcher, the city had begun its reckoning. But reckoning comes with resistance, and pressure had started to rise from within the precinct halls and backroom circles of power. Officers walked with clipped steps now. Some refused to look civilians in the eye. Others, bolder, talked about reverse harassment and public witch hunts. Carter had returned to desk duty, and though he was quieter, he still hadn't let go of his contempt. Shaq could feel it in the city's rhythm, the resentment, the defensiveness, the fear. But he didn't answer it with anger. He answered it with presence. That Sunday, clouds hung low. A blanket sky, pale gray and unbroken. The streets were hushed, but not empty. By 1:45 p.m., they started arriving. Mothers with strollers, grandfathers in Sunday coats, teens in hoodies and beat-up sneakers, teachers, bus drivers, store clerks, mechanics, students. They said nothing. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a single line across the front of the police department, then a second line behind it, and a third. Within minutes it was hundreds deep. No chants, no drums, no signs. Just silence. Inside, Carter watched from the blinds of the second-floor window. His jaw tightened as the crowd grew. He muttered something under his breath, and turned to Holt. "They're not protesting, they're performing." Holt didn't respond. "Actors," Carter said louder, as if trying to convince himself. "Trying to trap us." Still nothing. At exactly 2:00 p.m., the church bells from St. Agnes rang once. No one moved. No one spoke. Shaq stood 5 rows back. Not at the front, not in the middle, just another figure among the crowd. He wore a black windbreaker, hands in his pockets, eyes steady. He didn't raise a fist. He didn't hold a sign. He simply stood. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 20. Inside the station, unease festered. Officers shifted behind desks, glancing at each other. The quiet outside pressed against the walls like a weight. Carter snapped. He marched down the steps and threw open the precinct door, stepping out onto the concrete landing. "What is this?" he barked. "You want a circus? Go to the damn theater." No one flinched. He stepped forward, trying to provoke anyone.
"You think this means something? You're wasting your Sunday. Go home."
But the crowd held. Some closed their eyes. Some looked past him. But most just stared. Not in anger, but with an immovable calm that made Carter look small. Shaq didn't react. He didn't move a muscle. Later, when asked why he didn't speak, he answered simply, "Because silence was the first language they used against us. Now it's ours." That single sentence would become part of textbooks one day. By 2:30 p.m., the silence had grown into something living. It pulsed in the stillness. A protest with no noise, but with more power than 1,000 chants. Even those watching from apartment windows fell quiet. Even the birds, it seemed, had left the square alone. Local journalists, tipped off by volunteers, arrived late. They expected chaos sirens, shouting. What they found was a frozen tableau of quiet resistance. One captured the image that would later define the moment. A wide shot, slightly tilted, where the tall silhouette of Shaq stood against the cold gray of the police building, flanked by neighbors and strangers alike. No slogan, no banner, just a collective stillness that screamed everything no one was saying. They called it the Ashford freeze. Within hours, it spread. By midnight, it had crossed state lines. By morning, it had crossed oceans. In New York, students mimicked it. In Oakland, veterans joined in. In Atlanta, pastors stood in their pulpits and went silent for 1 minute before delivering sermons. Silence had become a movement. Shaq didn't claim it. He didn't name it. He simply returned to work on Monday. At City Hall, the council was divided. Some wanted to lean into the moment, to draft statements and resolutions, and ride the wave of public approval. Others panicked. The freeze had disrupted their comfort zones. Silence was harder to dismiss than protest. It had no edges to argue with. Councilman Riggs called an emergency meeting. "We need to control the narrative," he said. "We need to get ahead of it." Shaq, seated at the end of the table, shook his head. "You're not ahead of anything," he said. "You're just finally catching up." They didn't argue. Not because they agreed, but because they knew the city had already decided which side of the line it stood on, and it wasn't theirs. At the precinct, change moved uncomfortably. Mandatory cultural bias training was no longer symbolic. Oversight was no longer optional. Patrol shifts were monitored by civilian observers. And the data dashboard Shaq's office quietly built was now public, allowing anyone to view, in real time, police activity by zip code. Some officers quit, others adapted, and some, like Holt, started listening more than talking. One afternoon, he passed Shaq in the hallway. "Wasn't ready for that Sunday," he admitted. "You're not supposed to be," Shaq replied, "but you can still show up for the next one." It wasn't an invitation. It was a mirror. That winter, Ashford Heights changed in small but permanent ways. Not in grand gestures, but in the way silence had taught them to pause before dismissing pain. Council meetings saw more public attendance. Youth council applications tripled. Police complaints dropped, but more importantly, so did incidents of escalation. The city wasn't healed. It was aware. And awareness, Shaq often said, was the first step toward integrity. In a podcast interview months later, a journalist asked Shaq how he planned it all. The freeze, the imagery, the viral impact. "I didn't," he said. "I just stopped explaining pain and let people feel what silence feels like when it's aimed back at power." Then he smiled, a little tired. "They can't unfeel it now." And that was the point. Because some moments don't need marches. Some revolutions don't need words. Some cities don't fall with fire. They fall silent. And when they rise again, they don't forget who stood still and made them listen. They thought they were being clever. An anonymous 911 call. Nothing traceable. Just a description vague enough to raise concern. Specific enough to weaponize. A large black male, possibly armed, loitering near the youth center after hours. That's all it took. 3 cruisers arrived within minutes. Sirens low but lights high. The kind of approach that wasn't about safety. It was about message. The youth center parking lot flooded in red and blue flashes. The call came in at 10:37 p.m. By 10:41, Shaq was standing in the soft glow of halogen paint lamps, wearing his oldest hoodie, a brush still in hand. 3 high schoolers stood nearby, holding buckets and rollers, mid-project. They were painting a mural on the side wall, an abstract of the city's skyline, in twilight, blended into a young girl reading a book that turned into stars. They'd been at it for weeks, finishing it slowly on late nights, with donated supplies and quiet music playing from a portable speaker. The moment the first officer stepped out of his cruiser, the shift in tone was immediate. Hands where we can see him. It wasn't a request. Shaq set the brush down. The kids froze. One dropped a roller, paint splattering on the pavement. "No one move," another officer said, stepping closer. "We got a report of a break-in." Shaq raised his palm slowly. "This is city property. I'm the one who signed the after-hours access order. My name's Shaquille O'Neal." They knew who he was. The moment they saw his face. But no one stepped back. No one apologized. They just kept circling. One officer, a younger one with his badge still gleaming, asked, "Do you have ID?" Shaq didn't move. "It's in my back pocket. You can take it, or we can wait for the security footage to finish recording everything you're doing right now." Silence. One of the teens, Kamal, a senior who'd just finished his college essays, finally spoke. "He's the mayor." Another officer flinched, slightly. Another took a step back. Still, no one said they were wrong. No one said sorry, just the soft stutter of the police radio clicking on and off. What they didn't know was that Shaq had installed 3 new security cameras around the youth center a month prior. They were motion activated, full color, high resolution, and most importantly, the entire interaction, from the first flashing light to the last drawn-out silence, was caught on tape. The officer's tone, the implied threat, the hesitation, the cold, blank weight of power being misused. By 11:03 p.m., Shaq was back inside, cleaning brushes, acting like his hands weren't still shaking. The kids stayed, not because they weren't scared, but because they didn't want to leave him alone. At 11:25 p.m., Clara got the footage. She didn't ask questions, just labeled it, time-stamped it, encrypted it, and scheduled it to go live on 3 separate platforms at 7:00 a.m. The next morning, she left a single-line caption: "Ashford PD targets their own mayor." By 7:18 a.m., it was on every screen in the state. Local news ran it on loop. Cable anchors ran segments with one eyebrow raised, and their voices thick with disbelief. Social media was fire by 7:30. By 8 in, the national stations were picking it up. The video didn't need editing. It didn't need commentary. It spoke loudest in the silence. The way no officer acknowledged who he was. The way the kids weren't asked if they were safe. The way power hovered without landing, like a threat just waiting to be used. The governor's office called by 9:50. The chief didn't answer. By noon, the city council chamber was overflowing. Reporters clustered in the hallway. The mayor's seat was already occupied when they opened the floor. Shaq, calm, suitless, hands clasped. "I'm not pressing charges," he said. "I'm pressing accountability." No theatrics, just a folded manila folder on the table, labeled Procedural Conduct Failures, 911 Response, Novate Incident. Inside, transcripts, screenshots, policy comparisons, officer service records. Shaq had done the homework they hadn't expected. "I was lucky," he said, looking out at the room. "I had cameras. I had a name people recognize. But if it were Kamal standing here alone last night, if it were just a kid holding a paint roller," he let the question hang, "you think we'd be here right now?" No one answered. He didn't wait for one. By evening, the 3 officers involved had been placed on administrative leave. The precinct issued a boilerplate statement. Pending investigation. Full cooperation. Commitment to integrity. Shaq didn't respond publicly. But that night, he was back at the youth center. So were the kids. So were 20 new volunteers. Some teachers, some artists, a retired firefighter who hadn't painted in 20 years. Someone brought hot cocoa. Someone else played soft music from their phone. They finished the mural before midnight. It looked like a city choosing to believe in itself again. Holt watched the video alone in the precinct break room. Twice. Then he closed his laptop and didn't say a word for a long time. Carter sat at the other end of the table. A black coffee in hand. Untouched. "He didn't even raise his voice," Carter said quietly. "He didn't have to," Holt replied. And neither man looked at each other. because there was no defending it. Not this time. The game was over. The eyes were open. And Shaq had once again shown them how power didn't have to look like punishment. It could look like truth, held steady in plain view. Councilman Riggs tried to rally a closed-door emergency session to reframe the incident. Clara beat him to it. She published a timeline. A detailed one. Every step from the first 911 ping to the moment Shaq walked back inside. No bias. Just facts. Like bricks in a wall no one could knock down. Ashford Heights didn't riot. It didn't scream. It just watched. And this time, it remembered. The youth center had twice as many sign-ups that week. The mural was shared across school newsletters. The word setup became a symbol, not of weakness, but of how resilience doesn't always have to roar. Shaq didn't need to retaliate. He just needed to keep building. Because the trap they set became their own spotlight. And the man they tried to humiliate? He never even raised his voice. They came sometime after midnight. Silent as ghosts. No spray paint, no banners, just chalk cheap, pastel-colored, the kind you buy in bundles for children. By dawn, the front steps of City Hall were no longer concrete. They were a quilt of names. Some were bold, written in block letters. Others trailed off at the edges, as if written with trembling hands. There were dates, initials, and short notes in corners. Stopped 6 times in 3 months. Lost my job after the citation. He was 12. None of the names were tagged with protest slogans or accusations. Just stories, flattened into single words. Unexplained, unapologetic. And at the center of it all, written in uneven white strokes across the threshold, Shaquille O'Neal. It wasn't graffiti. It was memory made public. Chalk, the most fragile of mediums, used to etch something they hoped wouldn't be erased. This time, Shaq arrived just before sunrise. He didn't bring press, didn't wear his mayor's pin, just his hoodie, same one from the mural night, with dried paint still along the sleeve. He paused at the edge of the first step, scanned the names, took his time. He walked the path in silence, nodding when he saw one he recognized. Latrice H. Traffic stop. Malik R. Body search outside a library. Danielle T. Escorted out of a park for looking suspicious. He stopped when he reached his own name. Kneeling, he ran his hand just above it. Not touching, just hovering, as if making contact might blur it too soon. Someone had left a bucket of unused chalk on the stone planter nearby. Without looking around, Shaq picked a pale blue stick, rolled it in his fingers, and beneath the list of names, wrote 2 simple words. We remember. No camera caught it live, but by 8:00 a.m., photos had spread through every corner of Ashford Heights. And the city didn't hold its breath. It had learned not to, but it watched, closely, as if waiting for someone to sweep it all away.
No one did.
By 9:00 a.m., the council members arrived for session. Some stepped over the names. Some walked around. A few stopped to read them. None spoke. Inside, Clara placed a manila folder on each desk. Quiet as a storm. Inside, the final investigation report from the youth center incident, complete with officer transcripts, GPS logs, and internal messages that confirmed what many already suspected. The anonymous call had come from inside the department. Masked, rerouted, traced anyway. The document ended with 2 simple conclusions. First, Chief Dorsey had failed to report prior misconduct involving those involved. Second, the culture of targeted bias had been tolerated and obscured. At 11:12 a.m., Dorsey resigned. No speech, no statement, just an email and a locked office door. By noon, Officers Carter and Holt had been placed on extended suspension, pending final review by the Civilian Oversight Board. But there were no cheers, no celebratory headlines, just the slow turning of the city's pulse, a wheel grinding forward, reluctantly but unmistakably. Shaq spent the afternoon back where he felt it mattered, at the youth center. The chalk wasn't the only thing left behind that night. Someone had thrown a rock through one of the back windows. Nothing stolen, just shattered glass and the intention behind it. When he arrived, a girl, maybe 11, quiet, always in the back during poetry sessions, was already there, holding a brush in one hand and a folded piece of notebook paper in the other. She pointed to the window. Can I paint something? Shaq nodded. She unfolded the paper. A short poem. If a window breaks, we write light in its place. She didn't say much else, just started painting. Pale yellow streaks at first, like sunrise. then blue swirls, then carefully inked lines of the poem itself, right across the jagged outline of the cracks. Shaq helped hold the ladder steady. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was healing. By nightfall, 3 more kids had joined. The mural wasn't planned, but it grew. Flowers, birds, a patch of sky that seemed to stretch just beyond the broken frame. Shaq never left the ladder. Elsewhere, the city murmured. Some called what had happened justice. Others called it retribution. Talk radio hosts debated whether Shaq had orchestrated the moment from the beginning. Some guests accused him of playing the public. One commentator called it a brilliant manipulation of optics. Another said, he's still just a man with a chalk message and a PR team. Shaq didn't respond. He didn't issue a press release. Didn't call for a rally. He let the streets speak. Let the silence hold its shape. And the names stayed. People added more. With kids. With neighbors. Entire families knelt together, writing names they never dared speak in public before. It wasn't rage. It was release. No slogans. No agendas. Just
Marcus D. Accused, never charged.
Amira K. held 13 hours without counsel. J. Slim B. Wrong address rate. And every few steps you'd see it again. We remember. Some names were washed away by morning dew. But they came back. Scribbled again. Written bigger. This time in permanent marker. Then painted. It was never organized. It didn't have to be. Clara called Shaq that evening. They want a quote, she said. Newsline wants an exclusive. No. Shaq said. They want to know if you planned this. I didn't. They want to know if this is the end of something. It's the start. She paused. They'll say you're avoiding the spotlight. I am. Back at City Hall, janitorial staff left the chalk untouched. Don't touch the steps, someone wrote on a sign taped to the front doors. This is the city's memory. Inside, the council argued over what to do next. Proposals were drafted, task forces were formed, but the real change had already begun. Outside the chambers, on concrete, in paint, and pastel. Shaq passed by one evening. Walking home late, coat pulled tight. He paused again at the names, bent down, added one more. The girl who painted light.
No name, just that.
Because sometimes a city remembers its past with anger, sometimes with grief. But Ashford Heights, on that week, in that season, remembered it with chalk. And in the end, that was the mark no one could wash away. 6 months later, Ashford Heights didn't look different on the surface. Same streets, same brick storefronts, same cracked sidewalks in old districts. But beneath it, something vital had shifted. For the first time in 15 years, the monthly report from the Office of Civil Oversight arrived with a simple summary. 0 documented incidents of profiling. No flags, no caveats. Just one quiet line, printed in black ink on page 3 of a report. Most people had stopped reading years ago. Shaq didn't post about it. Didn't hold a press conference. He just folded the page, tucked it in his jacket, and walked across town to the old high school gym, the one the council had voted twice to tear down but was still standing. In part because Shaq kept finding reasons to use it. Inside, the folding chairs had been arranged in 3 clean rows. The air was hot, the ceiling fans loud, and the banner above the stage had been made by hand. Community Patrol graduation ceremony. Class of... It wasn't a flashy event. No stage lights, no photographers, just laminated certificates and handshakes. The program, a product of Shaq's quiet maneuvering and careful budgeting, had been launched without official vote. He'd pulled funds from unused civic engagement reserves, rerouted part of his own discretionary stipend, and leaned on volunteers. Some council members had scoffed, called it a political stunt. Others hadn't even noticed until the 3rd month, when complaints about unsafe blocks started dropping. By then, the unit, composed of community members, youth mentors, and retired city workers, had already walked 600 miles of beat on foot. They didn't carry guns. They carried notebooks, first aid kits, and patience. And today they were graduating. Shaq sat 3 rows back, in a folding chair identical to the others. No title plate, no podium, just a program folded neatly in his lap. Up front, Officer Timmons, once known for scoffing at Shaq's policies, handed out the diplomas. His uniform had a new patch sewn into the shoulder, a small, navy blue circle, with a skyline, a book, and 2 clasped hands. Shaq had drawn it himself on a napkin, 6 months earlier. Each graduate was introduced with their first name and neighborhood. Marisol, East Ward, Kevon, Maple Terrace, Denise, 12th and Shaw, Jacob. Formerly 10. They walked across the floor, took their papers, and nodded. There was no clapping, no roaring cheers, just nods, meaningful, heavy, like stones placed gently in a foundation. At the end of the line, a girl barely 16 stepped forward. Her certificate was bigger, an acknowledgement of her perfect attendance, and the 15 conflict de-escalations she'd facilitated without a single escalation report. Her name was Layla. The room knew her face. She'd once been stopped 5 times in a single semester, always on her walk home, always in daylight. Now she stood in front of the same officers who had once looked past her, accepting a certificate from their hands. Officer Timmons didn't blink, just nodded once, and handed it to her. Shaq met her eyes. She gave the slightest smile. That was enough. As the ceremony ended, the crowd lingered. It wasn't large. A few dozen parents, a handful of teachers, some old heads from the community benches. They didn't flood him, didn't ask for selfies, but the presence around him thickened, like the room was slowly realizing something it had once refused to say aloud. A woman in the back, gray scarf around her shoulders, leaned down to her son. Her voice was low, but the gym's acoustics carried everything. That's the man they tried to stop. Her son, maybe 10, eyes wide, replied just as softly. They didn't stop him. He slowed down for us. The words reached Shaq's ears, like a chord settling into harmony. He didn't turn around, just exhaled, deep and even. He stood to leave, tucking the report into his coat again. Someone to his left said, not loudly, but clearly, "Thank you, sir." Shaq paused, turned, nodded, and for the first time that year, answered aloud, "You're welcome." It wasn't a victory speech. It wasn't a mic drop. It was what dignity sounds like when it doesn't need to prove itself anymore. Outside, the sun had started setting, bathing the city in that golden orange that made even the old brick look warm. He walked down the steps slowly, alone. No escort, no crowd, just the feeling of concrete under his feet and something behind him being mended. The mural across from City Hall, the one the kids had painted, the one with the girl reading stars, had a new addition in its corner. Someone had added chalk words beneath her. Protectors don't wear power, they wear patience. Shaq paused to read it, then smiled. He didn't stay long. There was still work to do. Still books to order for the center. Still paperwork for the oversight board. Still more windows to fix. Still teenagers waiting to be taken seriously. But for one moment, on a city sidewalk, on a quiet day no one would mark as historic, Ashford Heights stopped pretending it didn't know who he was. They didn't call him Big Shaq. They didn't call him the guy from the protests. They didn't call him the man who shook up the council. They called him Mayor, and meant it. If this story hit something real, don't scroll past it. Ask yourself who's walking your streets unseen, unheard, uncounted. Change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the cracks until someone listens. Be the person who doesn't wait for permission to see clearly. Because the next Shaq might already be watching.